Our economy, in a sense, is built on a house of cards. It is fragile, and certain things are required for the game of charades to continue. Some of those things directly hurt U.S. citizens, like inflation. Yet some of those things, like inflation, are required and wanted by the U.S. government, who, at the end of the day, is supposed to be looking out for our best interests. And in a sense, they are. Why? Well, we're in so deep into this house of cards economy because of mismanagement and overspending that if they did the opposite, it would be worse. In this video, I'm going to explain why the US government needs inflation. And the answer is directly tied to the ticking time bomb that is our national debt. I'm going to explain how, because of this, inflation benefits them. I'm also going to explain who else it benefits, because the US government is not the only powerful entity that benefits from inflation. Now, luckily for you, there are ways to put the cards in this house of cards economy, no pun intended, in your favor. So we'll talk about that as well. Let's get started. Jerome Powell, Janet Yellen, and the President of the United States have all gone on record explaining how there's this huge fight against inflation. How getting inflation down to the 2% target rate is one of the dual mandates for the Fed. But if inflation is so bad, why not target 0% instead? I have a very in-depth video on that coming here soon, so stick around for that. But the short of it, well, they will tell you that a small amount of inflation allows the economy to keep growing, which in turn allows salaries to keep growing. But salaries wouldn't need to keep growing if prices never increased. The real reason for the 2% target rate is twofold. One, to encourage spending, because the more you spend, the more tax revenue is collected as that money changes hands. And secondly, the big one, because the government would be f***ed without it. The US national debt is above $34 trillion. That's 34,000 billion-dollar bills. The government brings in anywhere from $4 to $5 trillion in tax revenue every single year. But the government almost always spends more than it makes. In fact, the last time there was a budget surplus was in 2001. 2001. If the last time that you made more money than you spent was over 23 years ago, how screwed would you be? Yeah, now multiply that on a national scale. The national debt is not solvable. It's not fixable, and it will never be paid back. I mean, it's literally impossible because you need a surplus to ever begin paying it back in the first place. And even if we had a surplus of, say, $1 trillion a year, it would take 34 years straight to pay it back. And that's not including interest on that debt. So, how do you solve an unsolvable problem? Well, you solve it with inflation. The less that the US dollar is worth, the less that the national debt is worth. And a simple example of this would be a cheeseburger. A quarter pounder would have cost 60 cents in the 1970s. Today, $6.39 on average. Why? Well, because of inflation, of course. Now, let's create a crazy, unrealistic example to highlight what I'm trying to say. What if we had millions and billions times more inflation over the next 50 years? So that in 50 years from now, a quarter pounder would cost $34 trillion. That would, of course, mean that everything across the board would be more expensive. A car would cost thousands of trillions. A house, billions of trillions. And your monthly salary would be hundreds of trillions. But the national debt from decades before wouldn't have changed, which means that the current $34 trillion of national debt in this hypothetical future would be worth nothing more than a simple cheeseburger. This extreme example shows exactly what is happening, just slower. The government needs, wants, and loves inflation. And you know what? Yes, maybe it's a toxic relationship, but they are dependent on inflation because there's literally no other way that they're going to be able to deal with the national debt other than by devaluing it with inflation. Here's the thing though, the government is not the only one who benefits. Corporations also directly benefit from inflation. It is a justification for price increases. It is a veil to hide corporate greed. And I posted a video on TikTok basically explaining that corporate greed wasn't the primary driver of inflation. And it's not. Increasing the money supply, money printing as we know it, into an economy that cannot support it with higher production is the main cause. But even though I clearly said that corporate greed was a problem, people took me pointing the finger at money printing as me saying that corporate greed wasn't an issue. Let me make it clear here in this longer video. Corporate greed absolutely is a problem. And corporations will always take advantage of any and all situations to increase prices and profit. Inflation gives them a reason and a justification to do so, and a veil to hide behind. Not only that, but corporations also directly control employee salaries. So by leading prices and lagging salary increases, furthering the distance between those two, a corporation can again increase profit, increase its stock price, thereby increasing its value and increasing the value of its assets so it can further borrow and acquire funding so it can repeat the process all over again. So how can you benefit? Inflation is here to stay. Obviously, a 2% rate is the stated target. But as you've seen over the last couple of years, that's proving harder to hit. So, how can you set yourself up to benefit? And who's going to suffer? Well, asset holders are going to benefit. And those who use fixed rate debts to buy assets are going to benefit by double dipping. And who's going to suffer? Cash holders. And unfortunately, renters. And that'll still be the case, even if your income keeps pace with inflation, which that in and of itself is unlikely at best. And that's because even if your income keeps up, sitting cash will devalue as the dollar loses value. So cash under the mattress, or cash in a low yield savings account, or cash in your wallet. Basically, take an hourglass and flip it over. And as the sand grain by grain falls slowly, so does the value of the cash you hold. And renters will always rent at market rate based on the current demand, which is based on the current income. So as the dollar inevitably devalues and incomes increase, so will rent. Whereas instead, as a homeowner with a fixed rate loan, your shelter cost gets less expensive with every passing day. And if we exaggerate that years and years into the future, it may one day be as cheap as that McDonald's quarter pounder. But nothing is that easy. The problem, of course, is that nowadays very few people can actually afford to purchase a home. And this is one of the main reasons people really feel like there's an assault on the middle class. Because it's getting harder and harder every single day to do the things you're supposed to do to set yourself up for a better future. You're supposed to do in order to mitigate the bad things about the current economic structure, like inflation. So what do? You do what you can. You invest into other assets that are more accessible, like ETFs. You borrow at fixed rates over variable rates whenever possible. If you're a homeowner already, you do everything in your fucking power to hold onto that asset. If you're a debt holder from before 2022 with a sub 4% interest rate, you hold on to that debt for as long as you can because it's not getting any better anytime soon. And other than that, you just hold on and you hope that when this thing breaks, and it will break, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, maybe not in a few years, but it will. And when it does, you hope that you don't break with it and that you and this nation is still standing on the other side.